taking me a while. Sorry.
Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Gavork. Can you tell me what RER stands for and what the range is?
I'm looking for it, but I can't really remember.
Rachel, RER.
I got it. So it's from 0.7 to 1, and 0.7 would be like you're never at 0.7 because you're never only fat. You need some carbs, so you're more reasonable is like 0.8, and that'd be like low to moderate intensity. And then 1 is like very high intensity. You're using only carbs, and it's VCO2 over VO2.
Very good. So it represents
substrate utilization and intensity.
Intensity, perfect. Close my blinds. Look better. Okay, Lauren, what is lactate threshold definition?
Lactate threshold. That's the point at which the lactic acid starts to accumulate.
Good. Nina, can you tell me one way to increase lactate threshold? You got to unmute yourself.
I don't know, but I'm looking.
Okay, that's fine. Sophia, one way to increase lactate threshold.
Wait, one way
to increase lactate threshold.
Your bicarbonate buffer.
Okay.
Increase that.
How do we increase our bicarbonate buffer?
To intensify the workout, or?
Yeah, do a high intensity interval training workout. Because that uses that pathway. So that'll trigger your body to produce more bicarbonate buffer, which allows you to clear the lactic acid faster. So make sure you're giving all those details. Okay, you need a high intensity exercise. You need the bicarbonate buffer. And if you mention it, you should write it out, the whole reaction, and that it's helping you clear lactic acid faster. Okay. Kiana, can you tell me another way to increase lactate threshold?
Another way is to produce less with aerobic endurance training, which increases the mitochondria, the capillary density, the enzymes, and the myoglobin, which will increase aerobic capacity.
Perfect. Nice job. Okay. Melanie, cause of fatigue in the phosphagen system.
Can you repeat that one more time? Sorry.
What is that's okay. What is the cause of fatigue in the phosphagen system?
I'm not sure.
Shannon, what is the cause of fatigue in the phosphagen system?
Is that in glycolysis?
No, so the phosphagen system is another word for the ATP PCR system.
Oh. PCR depletion?
PCR depletion, good. Amber, cause of fatigue in glycolysis.
Is it the decrease in the pH?
Yes, what's that? What's causing that?
The hydrogen accumulation.
Could you repeat? Hold on a second, Gwen. Okay, so hydrogen accumulation is going to decrease the pH. Can you explain how that causes fatigue?
I don't think I have it.
Okay, Josue, can you explain how a decreased pH would cause fatigue?
So it slows down. It will inhibit PFK, slows down glycolysis, slows down ATP production, and it slows down muscle contraction.
Perfect. Ariel, can you explain another way hydrogen causes fatigue?
It's going to be competitive inhibition.
Explain, please.
With competitive inhibition, calcium and hydrogen are competing to bind to troponin. So troponin is more attracted to hydrogen, so it's going to end up closing the binding site.
Good. So when hydrogen binds to troponin, it does not pull tropomyosin off the binding site. So you can't cross-bridge, you can't power stroke, therefore it decreases muscle contraction. Okay, yeah, so there was a question to repeat the cause of fatigue in the ATP PCR system, the phosphagen system, which was PCR depletion. Let's see. Emma, can you give me another cause of fatigue from hydrogen?
Inorganic phosphate accumulation.
Okay, well that's in glycolysis, but it's not from hydrogen. So we did 2 causes of fatigue from hydrogen, but we need a third.
Ooh.
We did the decreased pH inhibiting PFK, and we did competitive inhibition.
I don't think I have it.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. Renee, the third cause of fatigue from hydrogen?
It inhibits glycogen phosphorylase.
Glycogen phosphorylase, yes. And how does that cause fatigue?
Is it because the change of glycogenolysis?
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't know.
Okay, so you got it. You just got to follow it all the way through. So if you can picture the diagram from the liver to glucose to G6P and through glycolysis. Okay, so glycogen phosphorylase is in the liver, breaking down glycogen into glucose. It's also in the muscle, breaking down glycogen into G6P. So if we inhibit that enzyme, it slows down those processes. So we're going to have less glucose, less G6P. If we have less G6P, that inhibits PFK. PFK controls glycolysis. So if we inhibit PFK, we slow down glycolysis, which slows down ATP production, which slows down muscle contraction. Okay, so I think it's really helpful to picture that diagram and then just follow. If you inhibit this step, it slows down everything that happens after it. Okay, make sure you guys spend some time on glycolysis fatigue. It's very, very important. Okay, and the other cause of fatigue and glycolysis was the inorganic phosphate accumulation inhibiting calcium release, which means you're going to have less cross bridges and power strokes. Okay, so on the exam, I'm less likely to say, list the causes of fatigue and glycolysis, list the causes of fatigue in the aerobic system. I'm more likely to give you a situation like Nancy is doing a 6-second all-out sprint. What is her cause of fatigue? Or Juan is doing a 45-second sprint. What are his causes of fatigue? Or Andrew is running, is 2 hours into his marathon and he starts stumbling. What are his causes of fatigue? So I'm more likely to give you a case situation, an applied situation, and ask you to describe what's happening. So in order to do that, you just have to be able to identify which system the person is in. And then if you know which system they're in, you should know the causes of fatigue in each system. So when I give you, I describe a situation to you, all you have to do is identify what system they're in and then list the causes of fatigue in that system. Make sense? Okay. So then we went into chapter 6, started talking about cardiovascular control. We talked about blood flow through the heart, coming in from the vena cava, going through the right atrium to the right ventricle, out the pulmonary artery or vein.
Artery.
Pulmonary artery because it's going away from the heart, even though it's carrying deoxygenated blood, through the pulmonary artery to the lungs, where we have the gas exchange, putting oxygen into the blood, putting carbon dioxide out of the blood into the lungs so we can expire it, through the pulmonary vein back to the left atrium, left ventricle, out through the aorta, and then out to the body. From the aorta branches off and gets smaller into arteries, which branch off and get smaller into arterioles, which branch off and get smaller into capillaries. That's where they have the gas exchange at the muscle, dropping off the oxygen at the muscle, picking up the carbon dioxide that the muscle produced, and then heading back towards the heart through the venules, and then the veins, and then into the right side of the heart, and the whole process starts again. Okay, we're good with that terminology? Okay, then we did cardiac autoconduction, which is the heart controlling its own electrical activity and contraction sequence. So we had, let me go back to my whiteboard. So when I have the whiteboard on, can you guys see me? Nod your head yes, or shake your head no.
No.
Like
Okay.
your face?
Yeah, can you see my face?
I can
Yes,
see
you
your
just have
face,
to.
it's just in a different window.
Okay, so if you can't see me, it's probably because you're on speaker view. And in speaker view, I think you can only see the speaker and yourself. My whiteboard is not the speaker. My whiteboard is like another participant who's just sharing my screen. So if you put it on gallery view, I think is where you can see me and everybody else. Yeah, you guys are talking about pinning the video. I have no idea how to do that. So if you want to figure that out, that's cool too. Okay, so I'm on the whiteboard. And let's see, I drew heart. We had, what's this called?
Sinoatrial node.
Sinoatrial node. It has 3 responsibilities. Arpi, what are they?
I'm not sure actually. I believe.
Okay. Sung, what are they?
They initiates the electrical signal, sets rhythm, and then contracts the atria.
Good. Sets the rhythm at
100 beats per minute.
100 beats per minute. Perfect. Contracts the atria. Then the signal goes to the AV node. Pamela, what does the AV node do?
Delay signal so atria can contract and ventricle can fill.
Good. So it's going to slow down the signal so we can finish moving the blood into the ventricle. We want to get as much blood into the ventricles as we can so that we can be efficient with pumping out blood with each contraction. Okay. Then the signal travels down the septum of the heart through the AV bundle, or the bundle of His, and then up through the Purkinje fibers, which cause contraction in the ventricles. Everybody's good with that? Yes? Okay, then we talked about other things acting on the SA node. So if nothing's acting on the SA node, it's at 100 beats per minute. Other things acting on the SA node, it can slow it down below 100 beats per minute or up above 100 beats per minute, right? And so we drew this, 100 beats per minute. Okay, if your heart rate is slowing down, it's because of a decrease in parasympathetic nervous system activity, specifically decreased vagal tone. If your heart rate is speeding up, sorry, that's not right. If your heart rate is decreasing, it's increased parasympathetic nervous system activity. increased vagal tone. So an increased vagal tone, the vagus nerve is parasympathetic, which means it wants to slow everything down. So if your vagus nerve is very active, your heart rate will be low. Okay, if we have an increase in heart rate above 100 beats per minute, that's due to increased sympathetic nervous system activity, specifically sympathetic cardiac nerve and epinephrine. Okay, but most of the time what's happening is when we're talking about exercise, we're going from resting towards 100. So we're increasing from 60 to 100. That's not sympathetic activity that's causing that increase. It's a withdrawal of parasympathetic activity. Decreased vagal tone. Okay, so so just think about it as separation at 100 beats per minute. Everything below 100 beats per minute is controlled by the parasympathetic system. Everything above 100 beats per minute is controlled by the sympathetic system. Okay, and that's where we ended, right? And I said I had another drawing for you. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Evelyn. Okay, so same information, just drawn in a different way in a graph. So this is increasing intensity. This is heart rate. Sorry, the writing is, I have not mastered writing on this thing. So reasonable low heart rate, 60 beats per minute. Reasonable max heart rate, 200 for a 20-year-old. Okay, and we're just talking about low, medium, high intensity. So we know as intensity increases, your heart rate increases. It's a linear relationship. Okay, we already know that. What I'm going to add on here is this 100 beats per minute. Significance of 100 beats per minute is it's the natural sinus rhythm. Okay, so increases in heart rate from 60 to 100 are due to what? Nina? Ben, what are the increases in heart rate here due to?
Parasympathetic increase in exercise.
But what's causing the increase in heart rate?
The vagus nerve.
Yes, increasing activity or decreasing activity?
Decreasing.
Yes, so a decreased parasympathetic nervous system activity, specifically decreased vagal tone. So the increases from 60 to 100 are caused by withdrawal of the parasympathetic system, lower vagal tone. Okay. The increases up here, above 100 beats per minute, would be due to increased sympathetic nervous system activity, specifically through the sympathetic cardiac nerve and epinephrine. Okay, I'm abbreviating those. Make sure you know what they stand for and how to spell them, because you cannot abbreviate them on the test. Okay, so this is explaining the increases in heart rate during exercise, from rest all the way up. Okay, so you should be able to draw and label a graph like this or explain it. Okay, questions on that?
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
On the test, do you care how we're answering this question? Would you rather use the arrow or the graph?
The graph.
Okay.
Yeah, I use the arrow to lead you up to the graph, but the graph is the best depiction of this topic. And let me give you a name for it, because I haven't named this for you. So we talked about cardiac autoconduction, the heart controlling itself, and then we talked about these external factors acting on the SA node. Let me put my whiteboard down. And so let me just give you some other terms to use for that. So you know the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic? Something that's intrinsic is controlled by yourself. Something that's extrinsic has an external effect. Something external is affecting it. So cardiac autoconduction can also be referred to as intrinsic control of heart rate. It's the heart controlling its own rhythm. Okay, these external factors acting on the SA node to increase and decrease your heart rate, that would be extrinsic control of heart rate. So if I ask you about intrinsic control of heart rate, I'm asking you to explain cardiac autoconduction, which is the SA node, the AV node, the bundle, and the Purkinje fibers. Okay, if I'm asking you to explain extrinsic control of heart rate, that's the vagus nerve, sympathetic cardiac nerve, and epinephrine acting on the SA node, and that's that graph. Good? Okay, we've got a lot of terminology coming at you today. So we're moving on. That took us a long time. That was all review. I used up all my time. Okay, so some more terminology. Rachel, you're amazing. I'm going to have you teach the class for me. The information you're giving here is great. Okay, so let me go back to my whiteboard. That's true, there were technical difficulties at first that wasted some of my time. Okay, so some terminology for you. Cardiac cycle. Cardiac cycle is everything that occurs during one heartbeat. Everything that occurs during what heartbeat? The name of the graph, Emily, was extrinsic control of heart rate. So cardiac cycle is everything that occurs in one heartbeat. So remember, when the heart beats, all the chambers are not contracting at once. It's not right side, left side. It's atria contract and then ventricles contract. So contraction of the atria followed by contraction of the ventricles is one cardiac cycle. Okay, that's complete contraction of the heart. So that's why when we talk about heart rate, it's like, we can refer to it as like a lub-dub, because it's a two-part contraction, atria and then ventricles. So the names for those are diastole and systole. So diastole is when the ventricles are relaxed and the atria are contracting. So during diastole, atria are contracting and moving blood into the ventricles. So the ventricles are relaxed and filling. Okay, I'll say that again. Diastole is when the ventricles are relaxed and filling, the atria are contracting and emptying. Okay, so systole is the opposite. Systole is when the ventricles are contracting and emptying and the atria are relaxed and filling. Systole is when the ventricles are contracting and emptying and the atria are relaxing and filling. Okay, so in diastole, ventricles are relaxed, atria are contracting, blood is moving from the atria to the ventricles, and then the ventricles contract and the atria are relaxed, the atria are filling from above, ventricles are emptying. So cardiac cycle consists of diastole and systole. You need to know those terms. Cardiac cycle. Okay, so if we draw one cardiac cycle as it appears on an EKG, the EKG represents the electrical activity of the heart. So it looks like something like this. It's not a great drawing, but so everybody's seen something like that as the basic EKG. This is one cardiac cycle on an EKG. This is a normal cardiac cycle on an EKG. When you get into 446, they go into abnormal EKGs. But I just want to introduce you to the normal one so that you have a little bit of foundation. So this represents electrical activity. So when there's a spike, it means electrical activity is increased. The larger the spike, the more electrical activity. Okay, so this first wave right here represents atrial, oops, let me make it smaller. Atrial depolarization. So atrial depolarization is going to be contraction of the atria. That's going to be diastole, right? Okay, so this is called the P wave. Okay, then we have the QRS complex, which is that larger wave. QRS complex, represents ventricular depolarization and atrial repolarization. So that's why this wave is bigger. Number one, because the ventricles are larger, so they have more electrical activity, and also because it's atrial repolarization at the same time. So there's more electrical activity happening during this time. Okay, then this last bump, this last wave is the T wave, PQRST. T wave represents ventricular repolarization. Okay, so that's all you need to know about drawing the EKG for the cardiac cycle. It's just the basic normal EKG. Okay, if you want to screenshot that real quick, you can, because I'm about to take it off and go into some more terminology. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so terminology. We talked about heart rate already, beats per minute. We have a resting heart rate, which is the lowest our heart rate can go. We have a max heart rate, which is the highest our heart rate can go. Everything in between is considered submax. So kind of like what we talked about with the VO2, we had a resting VO2, which was 3.5 mL per kg per minute. We had a max VO2, which is like usually somewhere between 40 and 60. And anything in between while you're exercising is submax VO2. So same thing with your heart rate. Resting heart rate, normal resting heart rate is anything between 60 and 100 beats per minute. Okay, a more fit person will be on the lower end between 60 and 80, and we'll talk about why later in the semester. Less fit person might be between 80 and 100, but anything between 60 and 100 is considered normal. If you have a resting heart rate above 100 beats per minute, that's tachycardia. Tachycardia is a resting heart rate above 100 beats per minute. If you have a resting heart rate below 60 beats per minute, that's bradycardia. Okay, so tachycardia is an abnormally high resting heart rate. Bradycardia is an abnormally low resting heart rate. Heart rate is controlled by the SA node. So we'll consider the SA node the effector for heart rate. If you want to have an effect on the heart rate, you have to act on the SA node. The SA node is in control of the heart rate. Okay, then we have trying to line these up. Stroke volume, which we will abbreviate as SV. Definition of stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped by the left ventricle per beat. Stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped by the left ventricle per beat. So volume referring to the amount of blood, stroke referring to one contraction. Okay, and we're mostly concerned with what the left ventricle is doing because that's what's pumping blood out to the body. Okay, so the amount of blood pumped by the left ventricle per beat. This is controlled by the left ventricular myocardium. So myocardium, cardiac refers to the heart. Myo means muscle. Left ventricular myocardium is the muscular wall of the left ventricle. So that's the effector for stroke volume. If we can get that muscle to contract more forcefully, we'll get more blood out in each contraction. Okay, so left ventricular myocardium is the effector for stroke volume. Stop me if you have a question. You can virtually raise your hand, or you can put in a chat, or you can just unmute yourself and ask a question. Okay, because if you just wave your hand and raise your hand, I won't see you because I'm not looking at you guys right now. I'm looking at the whiteboard. Okay.
Could you repeat the cardio definition?
The tachycardia and bradycardia?
Just the bradycardia.
Yes, bradycardia is an abnormally low resting heart rate. So that would be a resting heart rate below 60. Okay, then we have.
Did you say controls the heart rates?
The SA node.
Okay.
Remember, if you want to increase or decrease your heart rate, you have to have one of those things acting on the SA node, telling it to speed up or slow down. Okay, then we have cardiac output. Which is abbreviated as, whoops. It's abbreviated as Q. I don't know why, but it's abbreviated as Q. So when I write it, most of the time I'll write Q. I'll say it as cardiac output, but I'll write the letter Q. When I was writing on the board, I would write the letter Q. So you need to know what the Q stands for. And on the exam, you're going to need to write out cardiac output, at least on this exam, so I know that you know what it means. Okay, so definition of cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped by the left ventricle per minute. The amount of blood pumped by the left ventricle per minute. Cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped by the left ventricle per minute. So stroke volume was per beat. So if you think about cardiac output is how much blood you're getting out of the ventricle per minute, that's going to depend on how much blood you're getting out in each contraction and how many times you're contracting in that minute. Okay, so that means cardiac output equals stroke volume times, actually, let me write it the other way. Oops, cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. Okay, so the amount of blood the left ventricle pumps per minute depends on how many times it's contracting in a minute and how much blood is coming out per contraction. So you need to know that formula. Okay, I have more terminology. Stop me if you have a question. End diastolic volume. End diastolic volume is the amount of blood in the left ventricle after diastole. So end diastolic means after diastole. Volume referring to the amount of blood in the left ventricle. So end diastolic volume is the amount of blood in the left ventricle at the end of diastole. Okay, so Andrew, what is the ventricle doing during diastole? I can't hear you. I see that you unmuted yourself, but
Hello?
yes, that's better.
It's relaxing and also filling.
Right, so diastole is when the ventricle is filling. So at the end of diastole, the ventricle should be full. So end diastolic volume should be a high number. Okay, end diastolic volume is the amount of blood in the ventricle after diastole, so when it's full. Okay, then we have end systolic volume, which is the amount of blood in the left ventricle at the end of systole. The amount of blood in the left ventricle after systole, or at the end of systole. Okay, during systole, the ventricle is contracting and emptying. We don't want a lot of blood left in the ventricle after we empty it. There's always going to be a little bit, but we want that number to be as low as possible, because when we contract the ventricle, we're trying to empty it. Okay, so end systolic volume, the amount of blood in the left ventricle after systole or after we've emptied it. Okay, so think about this. If I have a glass of water that has 100 milliliters of water in it, okay, I pour some of the water out into a different glass, and then that original glass now only has 40 milliliters of water in it. How much water did I pour out? Anybody?
60 millimeters.
60 milliliters. How did you figure that out?
Did 100 minus 40?
100 minus 40. So, okay, so if I started with 100 milliliters, yes, sorry, it's 100 milliliters in the glass. I poured some out and I had 40 left in there. You do the 100 minus the 40 to figure out how much I poured out. Okay, so think about the full glass as the full left ventricle. The full left ventricle is at the end of diastole. And the ventricle is relaxed and filling. So the full ventricle is your end diastolic volume. Oops, I didn't mean to make that different colors. That should be all the same color. End diastolic volume is the amount of blood in the ventricle when it's full. The amount of blood in the ventricle after we've emptied it then is, no. Sorry. And systolic volume, the amount of blood in the ventricle after we've emptied it. So that means the amount we poured out would be stroke volume. Okay, so we can figure out how much blood came out of the ventricle by looking at how much blood is in the ventricle when it was full and subtracting how much blood is in the ventricle after we empty it. Okay, so that means that stroke volume equals end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. Okay, so the amount of blood coming out of the ventricle in one contraction depends on the amount of blood that was in there when it was full minus the amount of blood that was in there after we emptied it. You can't see the whiteboard. Is anybody else having trouble seeing the whiteboard? Everybody else can see it?
I can see it.
Okay, I don't know what happened, Janine. I don't know. Okay, you can see it now. Okay, good. Will it ever be negative? Stroke volume be negative? Will what be negative, Melanie?
Will stroke volume ever be negative?
Well, stroke volume is the amount of blood coming out of the ventricle. So in order for it to be negative, that would mean blood would be going into the ventricle from the aorta, which is never going to happen.
Okay.
It's never going to go backwards into the. So, and also that would mean end systolic volume would be higher than end diastolic volume, which is not possible. If I have 100 milliliters of water in my glass, I can't pour out 120 milliliters, right? I can only pour out up to the amount that I have in there. So we could never get that to be negative. Okay, you will not be doing with these formulas. You just need to understand the concepts, and you need to know the terminology, and you need to know the formulas, but we're not doing calculations. I think there actually is a calculation on your study guide with these formulas, but it's not something you really need to do. What do you need me to repeat, Evelyn? You asked me to repeat something, but I don't know what you want me to repeat. So I'm gonna move on until you let me know. Okay, next term is ejection fraction. Ejection fraction is the percentage of blood that is pumped by the left ventricle in one contraction. The percentage of blood that is pumped by the left ventricle in one contraction. So it's not an amount of blood, it's a percentage of blood. So think about your percentage on your test. How do we figure out your percentage on your test? It's, okay, Evelyn, I'll go back to that in a second. Think about your percentage on your test. It's your score divided by the total points possible, multiplied by 100 to make it a percent. Okay, so to get a percentage, you take your score divided by the total points possible. So we're talking about what percentage of the available blood were you able to eject in one contraction. So to figure that out, ejection fraction equals your score is how much blood you're getting out in one contraction. So that's stroke volume. Divided by the total amount of blood that's available to be pumped out, which would be the full ventricle, which is end diastolic volume. Okay, so ejection fraction, the percentage of blood pumped out in one contraction is the stroke volume divided by end diastolic volume, and then you'd have to multiply that by 100. Sorry, I don't have space on here, but multiply that by 100, which will make it into a percentage. Okay, you just need to know the concept and the formula. How am I doing on time? Okay. Questions on any of those terms so far? I have a few more.
Yeah, could you repeat ejection fraction?
Yes, ejection fraction is the percentage of blood pumped by the left ventricle in one contraction. And then let me go back and do the end diastolic volume real quick because Evelyn said my audio went out. So stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped by the left ventricle in one contraction. End diastolic volume is the amount of blood in the left ventricle after diastole, which is when it's full. End systolic volume is the amount of blood in the left ventricle after systole, which is after we've emptied it. Okay, so stroke volume depends on the amount of blood in the ventricle when it's full minus the amount of blood in the ventricle after we've emptied it, which was the analogy I gave you with the pouring the water out of the glass. Okay, thank you, Mira, for answering that. Okay, next, I'm going on to the next terminology unless anybody else has a question. I'm going to clear this screen so you can take a picture of it if you want. It's just a terminology though. Okay, next term is blood pressure. So blood pressure is one of those things that we talk about all the time. We use it, we measure it. I don't know if you guys have done it in lab yet or not, but we don't really have a definition of it. So I'm going to give you a definition of it now so we can get into a little bit more detail. So blood pressure is the pressure exerted by the blood on the walls of the vessels. Blood pressure is the pressure exerted by the blood on the walls of the vessels. The pressure exerted by the blood on the walls of the vessels. So if you can picture the aorta right outside the left ventricle, if the left ventricle is contracting and pushing blood out, that blood is hitting the wall of the aorta very forcefully, so blood pressure would be high. When the ventricle is relaxing, it's filling, it's not pushing blood out into the aorta, so blood pressure would be low. So during systole, the ventricle is pushing blood out, blood pressure is high. During diastole, the ventricle is relaxed, it's not pushing blood out, blood pressure is low. So during one cardiac cycle, we have blood pressure increasing and decreasing, which is why we have two numbers for blood pressure. Right? We have diastolic blood pressure and we have systolic blood pressure. So diastolic blood pressure is blood pressure during diastole. Systolic blood pressure is blood pressure during systole. So we always have a high number and a low number. Which one is the high number? Systolic or diastolic? Systolic, because systolic blood pressure is during systole, which is contraction of the ventricle, which means blood is coming out forcefully and hitting the wall of the aorta. Okay, so we always have diastolic over systolic, a low number over a high number. So that's how the blood pressure is changing during one cardiac cycle. Okay, so let me give you a formula for blood pressure. Blood pressure equals cardiac output times peripheral resistance. Okay, so PR stands for peripheral resistance. So resistance refers to resistance to blood flow. So if we're resistant to blood flow, it makes it harder to get the blood to flow through the vessels. If resistance is high, it's hard to get the blood to flow through. If resistance is low, it's easier to get the blood to flow through. Okay, and we know cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. So let me give you a formula for peripheral resistance. Peripheral resistance equals the length of the vessel times the viscosity of the blood divided by the radius of the vessel to the fourth power, which I don't know how to do, so I'm just going to put a 4. That's the radius to the fourth power. So peripheral resistance equals the length of the vessel times the viscosity of the blood divided by the radius of the fourth. So I'm going to turn this, I'm going to come back to my face for a minute, and we're going to talk about each of those things. Okay, so the length of the vessel, how long the vessel is. Think about, imagine you and your friend are both drinking water through a straw. You have a regular 6-inch straw, and your friend has a 6-foot-long straw. Who's going to have a harder time drinking the water?
Foot.
The person with a 6-foot straw. It's going to take a lot of effort to get the water through that 6-foot straw. Okay, so the longer the vessel, the more resistance there is to the flow. It takes more work to get the fluid to flow through. So the longer your vessel is, the more resistance there is to flow. That means when length goes up, peripheral resistance goes up. If peripheral resistance goes up, blood pressure goes up. Okay, all of these things are directly related. So the next question is, can we change the length of our vessels? The answer is yes, we can. Because any tissue in your body, whether it's fat or muscle, needs to be vascularized. We need to supply it with oxygen. So as you gain weight, whether it's muscle or fat, your vessels get longer in order to vascularize that tissue. So it's actually very significant there's a number, I'm not sure what the number is. I think it's something like for every pound of fat that you gain, it's something like 400 miles worth of vessels that you're adding. That's insane. For 1 pound of fat that you gain, it's about 400 miles of vessels that you're adding. So if you think about what that means for your blood pressure, this is why obese people have a higher risk of heart attack. Because imagine how long their vessels are, how hard their heart has to work to get the blood to flow. Because the increased length of the vessels increases resistance to flow, increases blood pressure, okay, which is a risk factor for heart attack. Okay, good news is, as you lose weight, you lose those vessels. So you can decrease the length of your vessels by losing weight, decrease the resistance, decrease your blood pressure. Okay, questions on that? Okay, so the next one is viscosity. So the viscosity of the blood is the thickness. Something that's viscous is thick. Okay, so you and your friend now both have regular 6-inch straws. You are drinking water, and your friend is drinking chocolate pudding through a straw. Is that going to be challenging to get the chocolate pudding through the straw? It is, right? So an increase in viscosity, the thicker the blood is, the more resistant it is to flow. It's harder to get the blood to flow through the vessels if it's thick. Okay, so an increase in viscosity causes an increase in peripheral resistance, which causes an increase in blood pressure. So, can we change the viscosity of our blood? What do you think? Anyone?
You can with medication, right?
Okay, so yeah, you could take blood thinners. Blood thinners make your blood thinner, less viscous, which is a method of reducing blood pressure, right? Blood pressure medications are blood thinners for that purpose, to reduce the resistance, okay? But another way we can control our viscosity of our blood is through hydration. Your blood is mostly water. So if you get dehydrated, it means you've lost water out of your blood, which means your blood is thick, it's viscous. So dehydration increases your risk of heart attack, because if you're dehydrated, your blood is more viscous. Increased viscosity causes increase in blood pressure. Sorry, causes increase in peripheral resistance, causes increase in blood pressure. So staying hydrated is very important, especially for someone who has high blood pressure. Okay, and in the next lecture, we'll talk more about how to control viscosity. Okay, then we have radius. The radius of the vessel refers to how wide or narrow it is. Okay, an increase in radius would be a wider vessel. A decrease in radius would be a narrower vessel. Okay, so my computer just told me my internet connection is unstable, so let me know if I cut out or something. Okay, so you are drinking, you and your friend are both drinking water. You're drinking it through a big fat smoothie straw, and your friend is drinking it through one of those teeny tiny little red straws that you're supposed to use to stir your coffee. Ever tried to drink water out of one of those? Or coffee? Yeah, of course you have, everybody has. So it's very difficult to get the fluid through that tiny little straw. Okay, so the smaller the vessel, the narrower the vessel, the more resistance there is to flow. So a decrease in radius causes an increase in peripheral resistance, which is why the radius is underneath the line, because it has a different relationship. It has an inverse relationship. Okay, length and viscosity have a direct relationship to peripheral resistance. As length and viscosity go up, peripheral resistance goes up. Radius has an inverse relationship, meaning as radius goes down, resistance goes up. Okay, so a narrower vessel, a decrease in radius causes an increase in resistance, which would cause an increase in blood pressure. An increase in radius means the vessel is getting wider, which means there's less resistance to flow. So an increase in radius would cause a decrease in resistance, would cause a decrease in blood pressure. So can we change the radius of our vessels? If you have clogged arteries and a lot of the vessel is blocked, that means you have a narrower vessel, which means you have a decreased radius, which means you have an increased resistance, which means you have an increased blood pressure, higher risk of heart attack. Okay, but another way we can control the radius of the vessel, we can narrow and widen our vessels. I've been cutting out. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. Hopefully I'm not cutting out too much. I don't know how to fix that. It's just my internet connection. Okay, so what's the term called for widening and narrowing our vessels?
Radius?
Well, that's the radius refers to how wide it is, but the process of widening it and narrowing it, anybody know?
And
Vasoconstriction and vasodilation. So vasoconstriction is a narrowing of the vessels. Vasodilation is a widening of the vessels. So we do that in order to control our blood flow, right? We'll vasoconstrict to areas where we want less blood flow. We'll vasodilate to areas where we want more blood flow. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to my whiteboard for a second. So remember we did, hold on, the vessels. The muscle is here. We had the arteries. We had the arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins, right? Sorry, that's messy. So you know that vessels have smooth muscles. So the vessels have muscles that allow them to contract and relax. The vessels that have those smooth muscles are the arterioles. So vasoconstriction and vasodilation happens in the arterioles. So that's how we can control how much blood flow is going to this area. If we want less blood flow to this area, we'll vasoconstrict these arterioles. If we want more blood flow going to this area, we'll vasodilate. Okay, and this is not just to the muscles. This is to your brain, to your kidneys, to your liver, to your intestines, everywhere. Those arterioles are where we constrict, vasoconstrict and vasodilate. So, what causes vasoconstriction is epinephrine. So, as you're exercising, you are releasing epinephrine. Epinephrine is in your blood now, and it's traveling around all through your vessels. And everywhere it's going, when it gets to your arterioles, it's triggering the arterioles to vasoconstrict. Okay, epinephrine causes vasoconstriction. So this would be a problem when you're exercising because you're going to have vasoconstriction everywhere. But we need vasodilation at the exercising muscles, right? When you're exercising, you don't need a lot of blood going to your digestive tract or anyplace else. You need most of your blood going to your exercising muscles. So we need a way to cause vasodilation at the exercising muscle to counteract what the epinephrine is trying to do, which is vasoconstrict. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my whiteboard. So at the exercising muscle, the exercising muscle, we will have, the muscle will be consuming oxygen, right? So, and the bloods around the muscle, oxygen levels will be low. So decreased oxygen levels. We will have increased carbon dioxide levels because the muscle is producing carbon dioxide. Okay, so we'll have low levels of oxygen, we'll have high levels of carbon dioxide. Actually, let me just write these, I think it's better. we will have low levels of oxygen. We will have high levels of carbon dioxide. We will have high levels of lactic acid. HLA stands for lactic acid because the exercising muscle, the higher the intensity, the more lactic acid is being produced, which means we have high levels of hydrogen from that lactic acid. We will have a low pH because the hydrogen and the carbon dioxide are making the blood more acidic. So remember, the more acidic the blood is, the lower the pH. And then we will have an increased temperature because the muscle contraction also produces heat. Okay, so these 6 conditions, we'll refer to these as local conditions at the exercising muscle. These are local conditions that you'd expect to see at the exercising muscle. Okay, the muscle is consuming oxygen, so oxygen levels are low. The muscle is producing carbon dioxide, so carbon dioxide levels are high. The muscle is producing lactic acid, so lactic acid and hydrogen levels are high, which causes a decreased pH, and temperature is high because you're producing heat. So these conditions at the exercising muscle, in the blood at the exercising muscle, are sensed by a sensory receptor. Anybody remember which sensory receptor would sense these changes in the blood?
Chemoreceptor.
Chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors sense chemical changes in the blood. So when all these things are happening at the exercising muscle, it's sensed by the chemoreceptors, which will trigger the arterioles to vasodilate, triggering vasodilation in the arterioles at the exercising muscle. Okay, so you start exercising, your body secretes epinephrine. Epinephrine is now in your blood and it's going all around your body, causing vasoconstriction everywhere. At the exercising muscle, these local conditions are occurring, which is going to be sensed by the chemoreceptors and trigger vasodilation, which means blood flow is going to be directed to the exercising muscle. Okay, so as new blood is coming in here, it's going to bring in oxygen, it's going to clear out the carbon dioxide, going to clear out the lactic acid and the hydrogen, which is going to stabilize the pH and the temperature. So is this positive feedback or negative feedback?
Negative feedback.
Negative feedback because it's canceling out. So this is intrinsic control of blood flow, as opposed to intrinsic control of heart rate. Okay, intrinsic control just means self-controlled, nothing external. So we can have intrinsic control of blood flow through the arterioles and have intrinsic control of heart rate through the SA node. Okay, so don't confuse those two things. Epinephrine acting on the arterioles to cause vasoconstriction is extrinsic control of blood flow. Okay, intrinsic control of blood flow is the arterioles controlling themselves through this process of the local conditions at the muscle, and I'm going to give you a term for that in the next lecture. Extrinsic control of blood flow, epinephrine acting on the arterioles to cause vasoconstriction. Okay. Questions on any of the terminology we went over today? Or anything?
Could you repeat epinephrine and arterioles controlling one more time, please?
Yes, epinephrine causes vasoconstriction. So when epinephrine is in your blood, everywhere it's going, it's causing vasoconstriction, except at the exercising muscle. Oh yeah, I do have to give you one more term here. So at the exercising muscle, we have epinephrine in that blood trying to cause vasoconstriction. We also have the chemoreceptors trying to trigger vasodilation. So we kind of have this battle going on at the exercising muscle between the intrinsic control and the extrinsic control. The intrinsic control has to win that battle. We have to have vasodilation at the exercising muscle, even though we have epinephrine there. Because if epinephrine wins that battle, we won't be able to increase blood flow to the muscle. We'll just have vasoconstriction everywhere, which wouldn't work. We wouldn't be able to exercise. Okay, so the term for that is sympatholysis. Sympatholysis is when we're able to get vasodilation at the exercising muscle, even when epinephrine is trying to cause vasoconstriction. Okay, sympatholysis is when we're able to get vasodilation at the exercising muscle, even when epinephrine is trying to cause vasoconstriction. So it's this battle between the intrinsic and extrinsic control of blood flow, and the intrinsic control will win.
Can you repeat that one more time?
Yes, sympatholysis is when we're able to get vasodilation at the exercising muscle, even when epinephrine is trying to cause vasoconstriction. So it's a battle between the intrinsic and extrinsic control of blood flow, and the intrinsic control will win. So we're able to vasodilate. It will be more powerful than the epinephrine. Okay, peripheral resistance equation, length times viscosity over radius to the 4th power. And okay, other questions from this lecture or from the previous lecture or about the whole Zoom process, about the upcoming exams, about life in general?
Can you repeat end diastolic volume one more time, please?
Yes, end diastolic volume is the amount of blood in the left ventricle at the end of diastole. The amount of blood in the left ventricle at the end of diastole. The ventricle is relaxing and filling during diastole. So end diastolic volume should be a high number. We're not going to put numbers on that. You just need to understand the concepts and which numbers we want to be high and which numbers we want to be low.
I understand diastole and systole, but can you give the definitions of them again?
Yes, diastole is when the ventricle is relaxing and the atria are contracting. Systole is when the ventricles are contracting and the atria are relaxing.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
You said sub-max VO2 is in between resting and max heart rate. Can you
Resting
say the
and
definition?
Okay, so I talked about VO2 and I talked about heart rate. So whether we're talking about resting, whether we're talking about heart rate or VO2, resting is the lowest you can go when you're most relaxed. Max is the highest you can go at your highest intensity. Submax is anything in between, which is so while you're exercising. Okay, so if you're sitting in your chair, you're at your resting heart rate. Your max heart rate we can calculate based on your age. If you start exercising, your heart rate is going to increase. So you're no longer at your resting heart rate. Your heart rate's going to increase. That's your submax heart rate. If your heart rate gets up to 140 while you're exercising, that's your submax heart rate during that workout. Okay, it hasn't affected your resting heart rate. Resting heart rate is still 60 or 70 or whatever it is, but we're no longer at your resting heart rate. Now we're at your submax heart, your exercise heart rate. Okay, I have a couple of questions on the chat. Chapter 5 quiz is due Monday, yes, because we finished chapter 5 on Monday. So you have a week. Chapter 5 quiz should be due Monday morning at 8. Okay, question, 3 ways to decrease peripheral resistance. That's a question from the study guide, so I'm very glad you're following along on the study guide as we go along. So if you look at if you want to affect peripheral resistance, you have to look at the formula for peripheral resistance. Okay, peripheral resistance equals length times viscosity over radius to the 4th. So if we want peripheral resistance to decrease, we'd need a decrease in length, because those are directly related, right? We'd need a decrease in viscosity, because those are directly related, and we'd need an increase in radius, because those are indirectly related. Okay, so look at the formula and understand how the different components of the formula affect peripheral resistance. What is the name of the graph we drew? That was the extrinsic control graph. Yes, thank you. Mira's answering all your questions. Thank you, Mira. Any other questions? going back to chapter 5, what percent of VO2 max is due to heredity? 25 to 50%. I don't think I covered that, but I know that's on the study guide. 25 to 50% of your VO2 max is due to heredity. And we talked about how that's based on your lung size, your lung volume, your muscle mass. All of those things are genetic. So that's why 25 to 50% of your baseline VO2 max, untrained VO2 max is due to heredity because it's based on those things. But I never gave you that number. Good. Other questions?
Yeah, one more. So the videos that we've recorded through this process, you're gonna have somebody record it again and send it to us?
Okay,
Or
so
what was it?
Mira is recording this.
Yes.
And okay, so can you figure out how to make that available on
Yeah,
Canvas?
I'll probably, cause since I have access to upload things, I'll probably figure it out, play around with it later, and I'll upload it.
Fantastic. Do you happen to have a recording of Monday? Because my
No.
recording didn't work.
No, because I didn't have access to record then.
Oh, because I didn't get permission.
Mm.
Okay. Well, now I know how to give permission.
Yep.
But that means I might not have a recording of Monday because mine didn't work. But now I know how to do it, so we'll be able to do it for the rest of them. So sorry about Monday. But you can definitely get notes from someone else if you want. You guys can message each other on here if you don't have each other's phone numbers, which you should have at least a few. You guys can stay on here and chat with each other if you want. And I have office hours at 11. So it's the same room. So you can log out and come back in, or you can stay here if you want. Up to you. But otherwise, please work on this stuff between now and Monday. Don't forget to take your quiz. And then on Wednesday, we will review this and move on. Yes, I still have the exam on the same day. Nothing's changed. We're right on schedule.